Hello everybody, my name is Professor Rich and today I'm going to answer some common questions that English learners have about learning English. In addition, if there are any questions that come in live or people ask questions in the chat, then I will also answer those questions. This is a slight change from our planned schedule today. Sorry about that. So today's class will be questions and answers, and we will start right away. So, one of the most common questions which English learners have and which English learners ask is, what's the best way to improve listening? And I think people ask this because actually listening can be something very challenging to improve, often because it seems difficult to do something active in order to improve your listening. Like, if you want to improve your vocabulary, then there's an obvious answer to that, which is you need to study more vocabulary, right? But when it comes to listening, it's like, well, what do you do? Do you listen more? And also, it's a complex thing to talk about listening because there are different ways of listening, right? Like, you can listen to some music in the background while you do exercise. Or you could kind of listen to a radio program while you're doing work. Or you could really listen to someone one-to-one when you're having a kind of serious emotional conversation and you're paying attention to every single thing they say. So there are sort of these different aspects of listening, and they're obviously not all equal. Having English on in the background doesn't help. So we can definitely get rid of that idea. There is sort of some myth which goes around, and I don't blame people for thinking it. I mean, I experimented with this myself when I started learning Spanish in 2008 with the idea of just having some Spanish-speaking radio program on in the background and continuing about your day and hoping that there will be some magic transformation in your understanding, but actually that doesn't happen. So there is no magic transformation that happens when it comes to listening. I've just noticed that my little chat window thing isn't working, which is really frustrating, but I don't think I can particularly do anything about that right now. That's unfortunate. Not quite sure why that is, actually. Shall I do a quick investigation? Oh, I see, it's because I've got it off. Let's see if I can quickly fix this. So active, pop out chat, messages from people. Yes, we have it. Hello, Sleepwalker. It's a lovely application that I use to interact with chat, but it's a little bit temperamental. So what is the best way to improve listening then? So I think the first thing that we should be clear about is the input hypothesis, which I've talked about many times. But the basic principle for improving our listening is to apply Krashen's input hypothesis. And this is essentially, we should listen to comprehensible input. We should listen to comprehensible input approximately just above our current level. So this was Krashen's idea. Now, we can discuss about whether you should listen to something more difficult, less difficult, and there's plenty of conversations to have about that, as well as how exactly do you measure the difficulty of a listening? Is it related to the vocabulary? Is it related to the accent? Is it related to the topic? Is it related to the speed of speech? Is it related to how tired you are? There are many different ways that we can measure the difficulty of a listening text, but the point is that we should be aware of this principle because it is an important principle. So we should listen to comprehensible input approximately just above our current level, and this is a fundamental maxim which supports the rationale of communicative language teaching. So, if you've ever taken part in a class where the teacher asks students to talk in pairs or in groups in English and talk together with some error correction and so on, that's communicative language teaching, and the rationale for that methodology is underpinned by Krashen's input hypothesis. So the input hypothesis is like a keystone in that rationale. So the next thing I would probably say is we'll add in Richard's engagement hypothesis, which is we should listen to things that we want to listen to. So choose topics, people, themes, etc., which you are interested in, engaged by, and find fun or challenging. So we're just looking for that engagement. I think this is really a critical part of pretty much everything that you want to do that's sustainable. But absolutely we want to look for that engagement. So we want it to be just above our level in terms of ability, but we can understand it. Notice the word comprehensible. So not incomprehensible, but comprehensible. So if you're listening to something and you think, I don't understand this, then that is incomprehensible. And that means there's no point in listening to that. It needs to be comprehensible. You have to understand what the message is. And also, I would go beyond that in saying, like, not just, understand, like, very general idea, but there should be some specifics there, you know? Like, if you watch an episode of TV, you want to really know what's happening, not just the general overview of the episode. Like some guy got angry and something happened, and then, that's not enough. It needs to be more than that, right? Like, I know that character, and that character did this and said this, and so this character, so we're looking for the kind of the detail, not the gist. It's not just about understanding the gist, but we want an understanding of the detail. Of course, that doesn't mean you understand every single word, but it means that you do understand the detail of the listening. Comprehensible input just above our level. So comprehensible input, but with vocabulary which is above our level. So that's the idea. Combine that with my engagement hypothesis, and that's a bit of a joke, by the way. I called it Richard's engagement hypothesis for fun. Anyway, combine those two together, and then we have a good foundational strategy for identifying listening materials which we can practice our listening with. Now, we need to take things a few steps further because we need to talk about strategies, okay? And I think the first thing we could talk about are sub-skills of listening. And we may also think of these as being strategies to improve comprehension. That's not always the case. These are not one-to-one, but essentially the sub-skills of listening, many of them correspond to some sort of strategy for improving comprehension. So one of the easiest ones, I think, for students to grasp is predicting. And of course, we should bear in mind that prediction is something which native speakers use all the time, sometimes consciously and sometimes subconsciously. Now, the point is that as learners, we probably need to give these skills a conscious push to say, oh, we really consciously need to engage predicting to encourage that unconscious predicting or that sort of habitual predicting to start to take place. So predicting and making predictions is very important. There's a number of ways that you can make predictions. You could very simply just think, what's this guy going to say next? But that can be maybe not the most interesting question in a certain context or conversation. It's sometimes better to be a little bit more specific. So, for example, if watching a documentary about, if watching a documentary about green energies, then predict which specific green energies will be mentioned and how positively they will be presented. Okay, so we have a slightly more engaging question now. A slightly more engaging question where we're saying, hey, what specifically do you think is going to be in this documentary? And do you think this documentary is going to be positive about them? Which ones do you think it's going to be more positive about? Will it be positive about wind power? Will it present coal in a neutral way? Right? So these sorts of predictions, they might not obviously seem to be related to listening because it's not like what words will the presenter use, but they are related because they tune you into the context. The point is that you're making predictions about the context. So we might actually label these and say predictions about words and then predictions about content and context. And these predictions about content and context are really important. So getting into the habit of making predictions about context and content and intention and things like that can really help your listening, because you will find it much easier to understand stuff if you are tuned in to the context, and that's the purpose of having those sorts of predictions. Of course, with stories, predicting is super fun because you can talk about what's this guy going to do next, and is this guy going to win, and is this guy going to fall off the boat, and how do you think this guy will survive the jungle, and so on. And predictions get super fun with stories. And stories are a good opportunity to actually practice predicting, but you want to do it consciously. You want to introduce it. So this is something I'm encouraging you to actively do, that you might be watching an episode of TV, and in between the episodes, just have a think about, what's going to happen next in English, and have a think about it. What do you think is going to happen next episode? And especially if you have an English learning partner who you're doing this with, you can have a little conversation about it. And this is, of course, exactly the kind of activity that someone will do in a communicative language class in order to practice the sub-skill of listening. Is that the teacher will say, okay, talk for 5 minutes together. What do you think is going to happen next in the story or in the TV episode or whatever? And that is practicing that sub-skill of predicting. Okay. So I'm doing these in no particular order, but thinking of another one, we got parsing. So parsing is the ability to turn a wall of sound into meaningful parts. Now, you may also see parsing defined as separating out the words that you hear, but it doesn't need to be the words. We don't actually need to parse into the words. We just need to parse what we hear into meaningful parts. Those parts don't need to be words, because you can have a meaningful part that's bigger than a word. And you could have a meaningful part that's smaller than a word, actually. Like, can you parse that? I spoke to my friend the other day and he was like, So, you know, when you comprehend the and you parse it out and extract some meaning from that, and the parsing is the ability to separate that from everything else I've said. So that's the ability of parsing. And parsing is really a tricky one, because parsing seems to involve a lot of subconscious components. I mean, if you think about in your native language, when you're listening to someone speak, you're not actively trying to... I mean, actually, sometimes you do, right? Sometimes you do consciously have to really listen to go, what did he say, right? Even in your own language. So there is that conscious part of it, but for the most part, it's very subconscious. It's not something that we're aware of. It just happens. And so it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to practice. There are some things you can do, though. There are some things you can do. So first of all, I would encourage letting go of having to hear all the words, and also, so let go of having to hear all the words, and let go of having to, and when I say hear, that's probably the wrong word, identify, let's say, and let go of having to identify things as individual words as well. We don't need to do either of those things. We do not need to parse every word in a sentence, and in fact, when natives listen, they don't. Quite often, if let's say we have Robert and Tom, and Robert says something to Tom, and then later Tom goes away, and Tom talks to Sally and says, "Oh, Robert said," and then often Tom will misreport the words that Robert used, right? In the most common situation of reporting what someone else says, you misreport their words, because actually we didn't listen to their words, right? We just listened for the meaning. So we don't parse out words most of the time. So we do not need to identify all the words. Parse, by the way, simple way to understand parse. Parse means separate, basically. Separate into pieces. So you don't need to parse out all the words, and you don't need to parse into words either. Like if I say, I'm gonna go, right? We do not need to parse that into words. We can just parse it into he's gonna go, right? We have our little gonna chunk. So we can parse it into a chunk or a group, a phrase, a group of words or a phrase, right? And I would encourage you to have that attitude, because that will just in general make you feel a bit more comfortable about listening, realizing, look, you don't need to hear every word. We're just trying to parse out meaningful groups as much as we can. So another thing you can do is you can use a natural English website like Youglish to listen to phrases you're learning, and that will help you tune into the natural pronunciation for that phrase, and that really helps with parsing. One of the things that learners struggle with parsing, especially intermediate, is it's a level where people really struggle with this, where a native speaker will say something like, you got time, you got time, you got time. And then the learners are like, what? What did he say? Have you got the time? How can I possibly hear all those words in what he said? Well, you're trying to do it the wrong way. You don't need to hear those words in what he said, in what that person said. You just need to extract the meaningful parts of what they said. You got time, right? We don't need to worry about the individual words. We know what this person's asking, right? You got a moment. Got any spare change? Okay. All right. So some ways to encourage parsing and listening. I'm not going to go through all of the sub skills because we'll be here all day, but let's talk about one more. So predicting, parsing, and suddenly I'm going blank on listening sub skills. Come on, who's clever in the chat? Shout them out. What other listening sub skills have we got? There's like 15 of them. We've got things like listening for gist, listening for detail, and so on. But it'd be interesting maybe to talk about something else. Vocabulary mining. That's always a good one. I think identifying keywords. Identifying keywords. Yeah, let's do that one. So, identifying keywords, we might consider it to be a part of listening for gist. Identifying keywords is a critical skill for tuning into the context. Notice, I've spoken a lot when it comes to listening, especially. I've spoken a lot about tuning into the context. It's a massive deal. And I think it's not always consciously obvious how important it is to be tuned in to the context, and how much easier listening is when you are tuned into the context. It's much like this. It's like, imagine two situations. Situation one, I say, right, you and me, right now, we have a race to the end of the road. 3, 2, 1, go. Right? No warm up, just go. Then the second situation is we do some stretches, we do some jogging, we get a bit sweaty for 25, 30 minutes, we have a little rest, have some water, and then I say, okay, are you ready for the race? Now I'm going to race you to the end of the road. Now, if you imagine, in the second situation, you're going to perform much better because you're warm, you've got your energy systems are turned on, and you've stretched and you're ready for this race. But in the first situation, you don't have a hope, right? You might even injure yourself, like you go to run and twist your ankle immediately or something because you're not warm, you haven't started exercising, you haven't got the energy going, right? So it's kind of like that. If you come into a listening and you don't have the context, it's like a brick wall. So tuning into the context is a big deal, and identifying keywords is really one of the primary ways of doing that. And you will see native speakers doing this all the time. When a native speaker comes into a conversation, they'll just catch a word and they'll say, hey, oh, are you guys talking about the assessments, right? People say this in the teaching staff room where I work, right? Someone will come in, oh, you guys talking about the assessments, right? Or, oh, you guys talking about the, it's like I'm clarifying the context. I'm being like, hey, what's the context? Oh, is the context this, right? Oh, you guys talking about the half-term break? Are you guys talking about the pay rise? Right? So you just hear people say these keywords and then start tuning into it. So a way to practice this is listen to a random podcast episode halfway through. Listen for 3 minutes and note down the keywords you hear. Pause the audio. Ask yourself some questions. What are they talking about? Is the main one. What do you think they are talking about? And then listen again to check. So again, this is something that you'll see in classrooms all the time. In communicative language classrooms, when practicing this skill of listening for gist, identifying keywords, the teacher will give you a little clue, say something like, we're going to listen to a lecture. Write down the keywords you hear. What do you think the lecture is about? And then play the audio and you listen for 3 minutes. So if you've ever wondered why on earth your teacher does that nonsense, this is why, right? It's to train this sub-skill of identifying keywords. So I think that's all of the sub-skills of listening that I want to talk about. Obviously, there's loads of them. Is there anything else I want to say about improving listening? I think the other thing I would talk about, and this is sort of an answer to crashing, is I would talk about extensive versus intensive listening. So, intensive listening is listening to more difficult things, aka crashing, normally accompanied with some sort of study, like vocabulary mining or examining use of grammar in the audio. Extensive listening is listening to easy things which you enjoy on a regular basis for long periods of time. So this is not, as far as I'm aware, Krashen didn't comment on that. He spoke about the input being above your level, but there's also this idea of extensive. Excuse me. There's also this idea of extensive, where the level of the audio is actually below your level, and that you are then listening to something which is quite easy to understand. So here's a question for you right now. Can you follow what I'm saying right now without having much difficulty? Or is this quite difficult for you? And you might have a little think about that. If you would say that listening to me right now is something like a 3 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10 in terms of difficulty, then you could include Professor Rich class, a class from Professor Rich today specifically, as extensive listening, because you're listening to it, you're kind of engaged, it's quite easy, and, you know, I'm speaking natural English, which helps, right? And that would be extensive listening. The idea of extensive listening is you want to do a lot of it regularly. Now, if, on the other hand, what I'm saying is like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 in terms of difficulty, like you don't fully understand everything I'm saying, you can just understand some parts here and there, and with the notes you can kind of follow what we're doing, then it's more like intensive listening. Probably that means it takes a lot of energy for you, for example. So you won't be doing that every day. But you might, while you're listening, you might identify some phrases which you want to use, or you might identify that I say something and you're like, he said that like that, right? You know, in the case of some of our loyal members, you might say, really? Did he just use was instead of were in a second conditional? My word. Is this guy supposed to be an English teacher? So, yeah, we do also have the issue of kind of the juxtaposition of grammar expectations versus real English. But still, it's noticing, and any kind of noticing is important in listening. I would always encourage noticing. If you're noticing something you think is wrong or right or nice or not nice, any kind of noticing is good, because that actually helps you to improve with it. All right, so I think that's quite a lot to give you on terms of improving listening. So that was our first question for today. Now, I wanted to say, remember, it's a Q&A today, so if anyone has questions about learning English, just put those in the chat and I will answer those. Otherwise, I do have some pre-prepared questions to talk about. So any questions you have about your English learning right now, I prefer them to be a bit more general than saying like, is in correct in this sentence, right? So it's nice if it's a bit more general, a bit more kind of grammar-based, rule-based, so there's some general applicability to it. So if you have any questions like those, put those in the chat and I will answer them. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to our next question. So this is a common one, isn't it? How do I stop translating in my head? Do you guys have any opinions on this? What's binge? I got binge. Pachu's asking a question. I'll comment on that later, Pachu. That's a good one. Let's talk about that later. So, yeah, Zoya says just stop. Now, Zoya, I think, is a young adult. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zoya. But I believe you are a young adult. And I think when it comes to being a young adult, I do think that just stop is more of a possibility, or it might feel like that for you because your process of learning happened in that way, that you kind of magically stopped translating and that was it. Although I agree that it might seem like good advice, the other thing I would say about it is, you see, I would never, that's too strong. I would not usually discourage someone from translating because translating is an effective method of language acquisition. So let me just, I want to make that clear. I'm not disagreeing that it's not ideal, because it's not ideal, right? Translating is not ideal, but I do want to say that translation, however you feel about it, is an effective mode of, or an effective, what can we call it? Well, let's just say it is effective for language acquisition. That means language learning. That's definitely true. And communication. Like, it definitely is. It has loads of problems, right? We've got false friends, we've got it's slow, we've got that your English can sound like Spanglish or whatever, you know, to use the Spanish example. Sure, that's true. However, I just want to admit that it is an effective aid. And so if we say, like, don't use translation in your head, I'm not sure that's often very useful. Now, if we want to say there are many times we should not use translation on our phone, this I agree with. I think translating on your phone has very limited learning potential. So I want to add that. So, although translation with an electronic device can be useful in the real world to help you understand, in terms of helping you learn the language, translation with an electronic device is actually quite a poor way of learning, because there is very little engagement, and so you almost certainly won't remember the translation. So translation with an electronic device, it has very little learning utility. Oh, is that true, Zoya? I'm thinking back to when we did the recorded audios, and I thought you sounded like mid-20s or something. But hey, I suppose you can't really tell from someone's voice, can you? People can have all kinds of different voices. So translation with an electronic device has very little learning utility. So I do want to specify that we are talking about translating in our head. So what I would say, one way to get away from it is move away or resist word-to-word translations. The worst kind of these, for example, preposition to preposition. Oh, please. I think preposition to preposition is one of the worst kinds of translation you can do. For example, saying, like, a in Spanish is like to in English, right? Like, I really dislike that kind of thinking. So I would absolutely suggest moving away from that. Instead, we want to move towards meaningful phrase to meaningful phrase translation. And this kind of translation will actually help you to move away from translating in your head. Because if you're translating a meaningful phrase to a meaningful phrase, then you're already doing a lot of the work of just using the language in terms of meaning, which is how language works, right? Like, we have meaning and we express the meaning in terms of words. So if we're going phrase to phrase, meaningful phrase to meaningful phrase, then the only thing left to do is we get rid of the L1 phrase. That's the phrase from your native language. And then we have everything where we're speaking without translating, right? So an example of this could be right, something like sorry to use Spanish all the time, but something like la verdad que. And if we take la verdad que, la verdad que no, la verdad que no. If we say la verdad que, I always use this one, don't I? In English, we might say something like, to be honest, or, to tell the truth. There's different ways we could translate it, but the point is, I'm no longer going word to word. I'm going meaning to meaning. I know what is the function of saying la verdad que, right? It's not actually, we're not actually talking about the verdad, right? We're not talking about that. It's just a little expression to say, look, this is my honest opinion. This is my truth. This is my opinion. That's all it is. It's a meaningful phrase that says something like, look, truthfully, this is what I think, right? That's what we're saying. And so if we do this meaning to meaning translation, then we're halfway there to just speaking the language, right? Because we go, to be honest, no. To tell the truth, not really. To tell the truth, I don't think so, right? You see, we're already halfway there to just speaking the language without translating. And it helps. It helps. And I would argue that if you do this kind of translation, you will find that naturally the translation will stop because you're already providing the meaning and you start to understand the phrase. You start to understand the meaning of the phrase. But this is key that you do this, that you separate language into functional phrases. So groups of words that have a meaning and a function, and then you understand those with a functional phrase from your language. And to answer Anawat's question, this is exactly what interpreters do, a good interpreter, right? This is exactly what a good interpreter does. If you've ever spoken to a good interpreter, you'll see how good they are at it, right? They don't just like brainlessly translate word for word or even phrase for phrase. They're always thinking about the context. They think about what does this person really want to express with that, and then they try to find a meaningful group of words in the other language that expresses that. That's exactly what they do. Please excuse me for one moment. My cat was complaining and I thought she had some sort of problem, but there's no problem. I thought the house was on fire, but it wasn't. Yeah, I kind of agree with that, Zoya. I just think that this idea of moving to meaningful phrases, it's so important. It's one of them. I think it's one of the messages that there she goes again. Oh, Gingy, what have you got there? Come on. Oh, kitty. Yes, come on. So sorry, everyone. My cat caught a snake. Yes, you can get snakes in England. Did you know? It's an interesting one, that, isn't it? Small snakes. That's the third, I think, snake that they've caught. I don't know where they find these things, honestly. So it was unharmed from what I could tell. So I've released it in the garden. Hopefully he doesn't find it again. He might do. He gets very excited when he finds a snake. It's like he gets excited when he catches anything, but a snake, he gets so excited. He like has to make a lot of noise and start jumping around and stuff. Look, I've got a snake. Well done. It's not very good for the snake, though. Hey, dear me. No, not a mouse. A snake. In my opinion, the key is to think in English. Yeah, it's a little bit nebulous, though, isn't it, Sylvia? Like, think in English. Because if someone is like elementary or pre-intermediate, then how can you tell them to think in English? Because they don't understand any of it. So it's like translation can be a useful step to getting there. Sure, at some point, maybe you want to encourage yourself to have complete immersion. This is a disaster today, isn't it? All right. Maria says, sometimes I dream in English and there is not translations. Can you explain this? I can't explain it, Maria, but I think what you will find is that if you learn any new skill, you'll have some sort of experience like that. Like I've had it with video games. I've had it with Christianity. I had some interesting dreams. I've had it with learning a musical instrument. Like I've dreamt about playing guitar and like I'm in the dream, like practicing guitar and doing things I haven't done before and weird stuff like that. So, you know, I think it's just a part of how the brain works. Well, from what I know about your teachers in the 70s, Sylvia, they are the experts. I'd love to talk to some of those people, honestly. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. So I think that's the key thing for me, moving with translation. Just move to meaningful phrase, and from there, you will find that natural transition of no longer translating in your head. And please resist using Google Translate and things like that. These things are a crutch, right? It's like getting on a motorbike and expecting your fitness to improve, right? That's not going to work. So a motorbike is a good way to get from A to B. However, if you want to get stronger, the motorbike doesn't help. So that's the point with translation using an electronic device. So let me just see, because we had some questions here, so we might have a little look at those. So Pachu has said, what skills do we need more? Listening, reading, writing, speaking. So which skills are the most important? So of course it depends. It depends. But let's say it depends, but all things being equal, listening and speaking are the most important. 100%. And actually, I would argue that it's very close. Listening and speaking are both really important, but for your learning, I think listening is the most important. However, to communicate better, speaking is the most important. Like, if you can say things that someone understands, but you don't really understand them, that's actually a better situation, because at least you can express yourself, and then you can express yourself saying, sorry, I don't understand you. And that's helpful as well. Please speak slower. So I think speaking has to come first in terms of communication. But in terms of learning, I think listening is better. So if you have very strong listening skills, I think it really helps your learning. And actually, what you tend to find is that, to begin with, people speaking is higher than their listening. And that's useful because it gets you going and you can express some things. But then over time, listening becomes the stronger skill. And anyone who's upper intermediate or above tends to have stronger listening than speaking. You do rarely get an exception, like Manuel Gordillo. But actually, to be fair to Manuel, he has a very good reason why his listening is challenging for him. But, you know, you get exceptions where speaking is a stronger skill than listening. And actually, his listening is very good as well. So that's what I'd say about that. Sylvia says, today is Women's Day, not in the UK. Why not? I don't know. To be honest with you, Sylvia, I don't really understand Women's Day. I mean, can you explain it to me? I don't get it. Like, in some countries, it's like, it's a day when women get some flowers or something. You know, and in other countries, it's like, you know, the UN will do something to celebrate famous women or something like that. But what's the point of that? I don't know. That's my question. We'll talk about it. Let's have a discussion about this. What's the point in Women's Day? Most of you in the chat are women. So tell me what's the point in Women's Day? This could get very difficult for me, couldn't it? Actually, I love Women's Day. I think it's a great idea. Happy Women's Day, everybody. I don't know why I'm such a contrarian sometimes. I get myself into really terrible trouble. I think that's good advice, actually. Yeah, I do encourage that as well. I think that getting used to looking at the definition in English, I think is just a great idea. It's a great idea. How does artificial intelligence help to converse? Do you think it's close to a real teacher? No, it's nothing like a real teacher. But it's all right. AI knows more than a teacher. What do you mean by no? Just bear in mind, Pachu, AI is basically predictive text. That's all it is. So you're using predictive text to gain knowledge. Now that can work, right? Like if you go to Google and you type like, Keir Starmer is Prime Minister of, then Google will autocomplete and show Britain. And you go, oh, that's correct, right? But not always, right? So, I don't know. I love AI, but I don't think it's not replacing teachers anytime soon, ever, really, actually. I spoke about that before anyway. I think we should do another AI class at some point because it's time to update. I did one like 2 years ago, and I think I can update that a little bit. Yeah, I know what you mean there, Manuel. It's interesting, isn't it? When you really get into speaking another language and then you start, like that language starts to come into your mother tongue. It does happen. Downtown Mogadishu, where I serve the Lord preaching the gospel. Thanks for having me. Oh, well, that is really incredible, Vitaly. I didn't realize you are a vicar or a church leader or a layman preacher. I don't know, but that's wonderful. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, I don't know where Mogadishu is. Somalia. That's incredible. I had no idea. Wow. That's very interesting. But you're not, obviously you're not, with a name like Vitelli, you're not from Somalia, but you're there in Somalia now, preaching the word of the Lord. That's very, very interesting and maybe a little bit dangerous. It's all happening in all of the exciting Christian stuff is happening in Africa at the moment, isn't it? I know that for sure. Well, there's terrible things happening as well, obviously, but in terms of growth, there is a lot of Christian teaching going on right now in Africa. Mariella Mino says, I think you just have to relax and listen. So this is what I called extensive listening before, Mariella. Congratulate loved ones and pay tribute to women who contributed to society. Ah, that's nice. I like that. Yeah, of course. Why not? I think that's a great thing to do, actually. Yeah. I guess maybe the part of it which I find a bit strange is the fact that it's international. Like, why is it International Women's Day? Like, why not like I can understand, like, maybe in the US, you have, like, American Women's Day, right? And they talk about Harriet Tubman and so on. Lincoln's wife. I don't know. Oh, here we go. The ignorance of Professor Rich, the language teacher. You know, yeah. And then you have UK Women's Day, where we celebrate the women who helped give victory in World War II by taking over the jobs in the factories when they'd never stepped into a factory before. Must have been so difficult, so strange to have to do these jobs that men had always done in the past. Suddenly you have to learn this whole new thing, and that's what was going on. So yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. That makes sense, I think, to me. And I think it makes more sense to me the more you define it. So if you say, like, British Women of World War II Day, like, I'm like, yeah, I'm all about that, right? But when you say, like, just Women's Day, it gets a lot more like lots of people could interpret that in lots of different ways, and I think they do. So then it gets kind of a bit complicated, I think. But I like it. Maybe it's just me, the way my mind works. I like the kind of specific version of it. Also, why can't we just celebrate women every day? How about that? That's all right, isn't it? The women's rights movement. But again, Pachu, the women's rights movement was a movement in the Western world and the United States. So does it make sense for women in Saudi Arabia to celebrate the women's rights movement, for example? I mean, maybe they still need I don't know anything about this. Why are we talking about it? But maybe in Saudi Arabia they still need a women's rights movement. So then does it make sense, right, for them to celebrate that? Or would they use, maybe it would make more sense in Saudi Arabia to celebrate, you know, women's incredible role in the things they do in Saudi Arabia, because obviously women have a very important role in their society. And I think any Saudi Arabian man would say that and recognize that. But obviously they will not agree about the rights movement and stuff. They're not going to agree with that. So it doesn't make sense for it to be international, because for their culture, it's not You know, it's not compatible with the society. You know, so I don't know. That's the thing. The fact that it's international. It's not international, really, is it? It's like maybe Western, but then it's very popular in Asia. So how does that make sense? So anyway, yeah. Yeah, it is, Sylvia. But do you know how they celebrate it? In Vietnam, it's a day when you give flowers to women. That's what it is. And you write a card saying how beautiful they are. So it's like Valentine's Day, right? In like Vietnam. I live there, and that's what happens on Women's Day in Vietnam. So it's like it's a good day to, like, you know, give the flowers to, like, maybe a lady who you like, right? And of course, your wife, right? If you're married, you would give flowers to your wife and so on. Zoya says, how do English native teachers learn methodology? Do they go through CELTA, Delta? How do they learn? Yeah, I mean, that's the standard way, Zoya. So start with a CELTA. You study a degree, which will tend to be an artsy degree, and then you do a CELTA. And CELTA plus 2 years is considered the minimum for then doing a Delta. So you start, you do a CELTA, that's intensive 1 month, and then 2 years, and then you can do your Delta or your TESOL diploma if you go the Trinity route, and that's where you really get deeply into the methodology. And then from there, people will do masters, even a PhD, or they'll go another direction with management courses and so on. Oh dear, this is going to get very, very controversial and political very quickly, isn't it? All right, happy Women's Day, everyone. We're not going to talk about it anymore. Does anyone have any other questions? I think I need to wrap up. As you may have noticed, I changed the topic for today because I didn't quite have the time that I thought I had, and I haven't really eaten, and I'm starving, and I can smell my lunch. So I'd like to wish you all, yes, a wonderful International Women's Day and a wonderful day in general. And please do have a lovely, lovely weekend. Remember, if you have any future questions, please do bring them to the live streams. I'm always happy to discuss interesting questions. And I do apologize for subjects which I know absolutely nothing about, which we sometimes get into, and which actually I'd like to... Maybe I should start avoiding certain things, talking about politics and stuff. I don't know anything about it. Have you experienced passive-aggressive behavior? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And I have acted passive-aggressively, I recognize, as well, sometimes. So it's good to raise your awareness of these sorts of things, especially in yourself. It's not good to be passive-aggressive sucks, right? And anything like that often indicates there's something you want to express, and maybe you're not facing it head on. Of course, being head on doesn't mean being rude. Sometimes the correct thing to do is to just have a boundary and just think, I'm not going to talk about that, or I'm not going to mention it. You know, so I'm not going to be passive-aggressive. I'm just not going to mention it. And if the other person mentions it, you say, look, I have said what I think. I don't want or need to justify that. I respect that you have a different opinion, and that's all I have to say about it. I'm learning about this now, boundaries. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you today. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and have a lovely week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.